Claudette Colvin, Chapter 9. Part 2, Playing for Keeps. Browder versus Gale changed relationships of black and white in America and the world. Yet few people know about the case, and even fewer knew about the plaintiffs. Filmmaker and journalist William Dickerson Waheed, Rivers of Change. All the boycotts and sit-ins and marches in themselves did not cure the illness of discrimination. It was the court decisions that did it. Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. Chapter 9, Browder vs. Gale. Our whole strategy is based on the May 11th trial. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. May 11th, 1956. Claudette. I woke up to the smell of coffee like any other day. Every day, no matter what, Mom would get up and make biscuits, grits, sausage, bacon, eggs, or ham. I battle-fed Raymond. Then Mama Sweetie came over with her daughter Scrap to take care of Raymond while QP and I went to the trial. Mom had to work. Mama Sweetie was still a big part of my life. She had moved from Pine Level to Montgomery a few years after we had. She was about 70 now, a little more wrinkled but still petite and still kind. Just the sound of her voice in the house made me think things would be all right. It was cool out but not rainy. I was glad I didn't have to wear a rain bonnet. I pumped milk from my breast so that I wouldn't leak and put on my best dress, light blue with a cummerbund and a V-cut. It looked good on me in the mirror. I drank my coffee slowly and thought about the day to come. Then my cousin James Henderson pulled up to drive us to the courthouse. Before we left, we all bowed our heads and Mom said a prayer. We were around the table. Me, Mom, QP in his chair, Mama Sweetie, Scrap, James, and little Raymond in his bassinet. Mom prayed for me to have courage and for Fred Gray to do his best and for success in defeating this horrible system. Then we all said the Lord's Prayer and we went on our way. By the time we pulled up to the courthouse, there was already a big crowd waiting outside. Men in suits and brimmed hats and women wearing their Sunday dresses. There were cameramen on the sidewalk. I got out and went looking for Fred Gray. The crowd had assembled early outside the federal courthouse because May 11th, 1956 was a big day. It was the 159th day of the Montgomery bus boycott with no end in sight. The lawsuit meant hope. Some boycotters had been stationed on the courthouse steps since dawn. One black laborer explained his presence to a reporter from the Jet magazine by saying he had already walked 335 miles to and from work since the boycott started. But he said, while they're juggling that hot potato, the lawsuit, I'll keep on footing it. Legs were tired and nerves were frayed. Cash to keep the carpool was hard to raise. Negotiations between black leaders and white authorities had hardened into a tense stalemate with the whole Southern way of life at stake. Just a few weeks before, Mayor Gale and the entire Montgomery City Council had made a public showing of joining the White Citizens Council in a packed coliseum with thousands cheering their approval. The council was a group of powerful politicians and business people dedicated to keeping Montgomery segregated. A note: the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In Browder v. Gale, lawyers representing black rioters claimed that the segregation laws governing Montgomery City buses violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Ratified in 1868 to secure freedom for slaves, the 14th Amendment said in one section, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This amendment was used in several important cases during the Civil Rights era to dismantle legal segregation, including Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. Segregationists singled out Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., branding him a troublemaker, an outsider who had come from Atlanta to stir up local blacks. They bombed his house and threatened his life by mail and telephone. He remained outwardly unflappable. According to one magazine account, when someone called in the middle of the night to threaten that N-word who's running the bus boycott, his wife calmly answered, my husband is asleep. He told me to write the name and number of anyone who called to threaten his life so he could return the call and receive the threat in the morning when he wakes up and is fresh. City leaders convinced themselves that blacks really wanted to ride the buses, but that King's silver tongue had seduced them into rebellion. Police harassed boycotters as they waited at pickup stations for their MIA cars, ordering them to move on, threatening to charge them with loitering or hitchhiking, both crimes. On February 21st, a grand jury had indicted, formally accused of a crime, 100 blacks for violating an obscure 1921 law banning boycotts without just or legal cause. Those charged included Dr. King, 23 other ministers, and all the carpool drivers. Rosa Parks was indicted, as were Joanne Robinson, Edie Nixon, and Fred Gray. Claudette was not named, though her minister, the Reverend H. H. Johnson, was. The boycotters decided not to wait for the sheriff to come and arrest them. E.D. Nixon strode right into the county courthouse saying, "Are you looking for me? Well, here I am." He was booked, fingerprinted, photographed, and released on bond, wearing a broad smile as he stepped out of the courthouse. This touched off a parade of boycott leaders who filed inside the courthouse one by one and minutes later came out freshly booked and fingerprinted, descending the steps into a cheering crowd of spectators. Fred Gray, one of those arrested, later recalled that it had been an honor to have been arrested and that those not indicted felt a little insulted. But it was this hot potato, this lawsuit, Browder versus Gale, named after the plaintiff Aurelia Broder, whose last name came first alphabetically, and W.A. Tacky Gale, the mayor of Montgomery, that offered the first and best chance for blacks to end the boycott with a clean victory. This time it was their lawsuit, not one brought against them. This time they were using the Constitution, the rule book for their country, to achieve justice. The crowd of dark-skinned figures in neatly pressed suits and church dresses had set off for the block-long federal courthouse just after dawn because the Browder vs. Gale offered hope. Standing outside the courthouse that morning, E.D. Nixon looked around the crowd of his neighbors and friends and felt proud. You could read a happiness on their faces, like they already knew that they were about to see the start of something very special, he later recalled. There was a feeling of comfort going into the federal courthouses, which was very different from going to the county courthouse. We felt like we were protected here. It had been exactly 100 days since Fred Gray had filed papers to start the lawsuit, and they had been 100 days of hard walking and doing without and praying. But May 11th, 1956, the day of the trial, was finally here, and it was a sparkling spring morning. It was their day in court at last. The courthouse doors opened, and spectators formed a line behind the security checkpoint. They took elevators to the second floor, blacks in one elevator, whites in another, and stepped into a large, dark wood-paneled courtroom with a spacious, high ceiling. A note: Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. The judge who sat just to the right of the witness stand was the youngest and most recently appointed of 3 federal judges in the courtroom. In fact, Browder vs. Gale was the first big case for the 37-year-old Frank M. Johnson, who had just been appointed by President Eisenhower as the new federal judge for the Middle District of Alabama. Johnson later became famous for presiding over landmark cases of the Civil Rights era, including the decision to let activists march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, without police interference. He also ruled that blacks could sit on Alabama juries and that Alabama schools must be desegregated. He made it much easier for blacks to vote and required that black state troopers be hired in numbers equal to whites. At first, observers assumed Judge Johnson would reliably rule with segregationists, since he was from Alabama. But nobody could predict what Frank Johnson would do. He ruled according to the merits of the case. His independence came naturally. Johnson had grown up in Winston County, a small pocket of North Alabama that had sided with the North during the Civil War. His great-grandfather had fought for Lincoln and the Union. Tall windows were framed by pale yellow drapes, pulled back now so that the sunshine flooded the chamber, throwing soft spotlights into the blue carpet. Behind the 3 empty judges' chairs, a great round-faced clock with Roman numerals was embedded into the wall. To the left of the clock stood the flag of the United States with all 48 stars brilliant against a navy field. On the opposite side was the Alabama flag, sporting red bars crossed diagonally across a white field, fixed in the same pattern as the stars and bars of the Confederate flag. About 100 spectators, mostly blacks, settled into seats behind a rail on the main floor, and about 100 more took the stairs to seats in a balcony. Media were banned from the courtroom, but dozens of reporters and photographers staked out positions in front of the courthouse. Dr. King and Joanne Robinson were among the boycott leaders in attendance. As the hands on the big clock closed in on 9 o'clock, the air buzzed with expectancy, like the tension before a prize fight. The crowd's murmur subsided when the plaintiff team, including Fred Gray and several other lawyers, Claudette, and the other three black women, entered the courtroom and took their seats on the right side of a central aisle. There were only four plaintiffs now, since one of the women, Jeanette Reese, had dropped out under pressure from her employer. The city's attorneys and key witnesses took their seats on the left. At 1 minute after 9, the bailiff bustled into the courtroom, hollering, "All rise," followed close behind by three white men draped in black robes. Federal Justices Richard Reeves, Seaborn Lynn, and Frank Johnson settled into adjacent throne-like chairs and stacked their papers on the polished bench before them. The crowd sat back down and listened as Justice Rivers read out the plaintiff's complaint, namely that the laws and ordinances requiring segregated seating on public buses violated the equal rights provision of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Justice Rivers then turned to Fred Gray and said, "Call your first witness." Gray had carefully planned the order in which he would present his four witnesses. He wanted to start fast, maintain a steady pace, and finish strong. He led off with Aurelia Browder, a sturdy, well-spoken, and confident 37-year-old ASC graduate with a strong history of involvement in community affairs. She had raised 6 children by herself as a seamstress after her husband's death. She had seen a lot of life and wasn't easily intimidated. Mrs. Browder was called to the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She sat down. Led by Gray's questioning, Mrs. Browder described herself as a long-time Montgomery resident who had ridden the bus 2 or 3 times a day until December 5th, 1955. Why did she stop? "I knew I would cooperate with my color by boycotting. I would get better treatment," she explained. Gray asked if she had difficulty in connection with the seating arrangements. She told of having been made to stand up by a bus driver so that whites could sit down. Gray asked, "If you were permitted to sit any place you wanted on the bus, would you be willing to ride it again?" She replied, "Yes, I would." Gray then yielded the right to question Mrs. Browder to the city attorney, Walter Knabb, who tried to induce her by saying that the bus boycotters were nothing but puppets of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Mrs. Browder would have none of it. After several futile questions, Knabb excused Mrs. Browder and she returned to her seat. The next 2 witnesses, Susie McDonald, 77, and Mary Louise Smith, who had by then turned 19, gave similar testimony to similar questions. McDonald, a widow and a housekeeper for her son, said she was often mistreated on the bus and quit riding to support the boycott. She too said she would ride again if the buses were integrated, and denied that she was under the spell of Dr. King. "I reached my own judgment," she said. "I stopped because I thought it was right and because we were mistreated." Mary Louise Smith told of her refusal to get up from her bus seat for the red-haired white woman and of the policeman's arrival. "I told him," the police officer, "I'm not going to move out of my seat. I got the privilege to sit here like anybody else does." She also testified, "I would ride the city buses again, provided we had no segregation on the city buses." Knabb tried to trap her into saying Dr. King had bewitched them all. "He, King, didn't represent no one," Mary Louise said. "We represented ourselves. We appointed him as our leader, he and his assistants." After Knabb yielded, she answered one question from Fred Gray and was dismissed. Through Knabb's questioning of the first 3 witnesses, the city's strategy became clear. It had 2 parts. 1, to try to get witnesses to say that the black community had not been objected to segregated bus seating before the boycott. Knabb reminded them that before, leaders had always pushed for black drivers, courteous treatment, and a different segregated seating plan, but never for an end to segregated seating. This was true, but only because leaders had never dared to hope for integrated seating until the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled against segregated schools just 2 years before. 2, to show that Dr. King had stirred up all the trouble. The city tried to paint him as a silver-tongued outsider who never rode the bus in Montgomery himself, but knew just how to make everyone who did feel unhappy. If it hadn't been for King, the city contended, blacks would be satisfied with things as they had always been. As her turn to testify approached, Claudette fought the ever-tightening knot in her stomach. Fred Gray had deliberately saved her for last, for her story was the most powerful. She'd been arrested, dragged from a bus, charged with breaking the segregation law, and jailed. She alone had fought the charges in court. She may have only been 16, but Claudette had more experience than anyone else when it came to challenging Jim Crow on the Montgomery buses. Proclaiming her constitutional rights as the police seized her wrists that day, she had objected not just to the seating plan on the bus, but to the overall injustice of segregation. She had taken her stand without ever having spoken with Dr. King. Fred Gray and the other lawyers had faith in her. Mary Louise Smith stepped down from the witness stand, glancing at Claudette on the way back to her seat. Call your next witness, Mr. Gray, said Judge Rives. I call Claudette Colvin, said Fred Gray. After Claudette raised her right hand and was sworn in, Fred Gray took a moment to go over his questions. From the witness box, Claudette felt hundreds of eyes settle upon her. She scanned the crowd for familiar faces. There was Jack Salter, a neighbor who worked at the federal courthouse. He gave her a thumbs up from the back. She spotted A.C. James, her across-the-street neighbor who had come to lend support, and of course there was her dad, QP, smiling at her, always on her side and always there no matter what. Fred Gray asked her to state her name and address and tell when she had stopped riding the buses. After that, he led her through the account of her resistance and arrest on March 2nd, 1955. As Claudette related the story of her arrest, her voice became low, soft, and intense. Spectators leaned forward to hear her. The room gathered around the sounds of her voice. When she described the policeman looming over her seat, she admitted that I was very hurt and I was crying. And the policeman said, I'll have to take you off. I didn't move at all, so he kicked me. Claudette told of having been put into a car, handcuffed through a window, taken to City Hall, and locked in an adult jail cell. At this point, a spectator in the courtroom's balcony let out a wail and began sobbing loudly. Unable to stop crying, she finally stood and slowly made her way out of the courtroom. Gray paused a while, then looked up from his notes and said to Claudette, Thank you, that's all. But that wasn't all. Now came the hard part. Claudette kept her eyes trained on the city attorney, Walter Knabb, a slender man with close-cut, sandy hair. Knabb tapped his pencil on his desk, glanced at his notes one last time, and then advanced towards her, his eyes fixed on hers. The three judges listened quietly. Knabb began, You and the other Negroes have changed your ideas since December 5th, have you not? Claudette shook her head. No, sir, we haven't changed our ideas. It has been in me ever since I was born. Knabb persisted, but the group stopped riding the buses for certain named things. That is correct, isn't it? For certain things that Reverend King said were the things they objected to? No, sir, Claudette answered. It was in the beginning when they arrested me, when they seen how dirty they treated the Negro girls here, that they had begun to feel like that. Although some of us just didn't have the guts to stand up. Did you have a leader? Knabb asked. Did we have a leader? Our leaders is just we, ourselves. But somebody spoke for the group. We all spoke for ourselves. Knabb kept hammering at the point he was trying to get Claudette to make for him. Did you select anyone to represent you? Claudette looked away for a moment and thought it over. Returning his gaze, she spoke slowly. Quite naturally, we're not going to have any ignorant person to lead us. We had to have someone who is strong enough to speak up, someone who knows the law. It is quite natural that we are not going to get up there ourselves when some of us can't even read or write. But they knew they were treated wrong. Knabb sprang into his trap, or tried to. Is that Reverend King the one you selected? We didn't elect him. You said you selected somebody who was better informed to represent you. Now who did you select? Well, I don't know anything about selections, but we all just got together. But somebody spoke for your group, Knabb insisted. Now, who was it? I don't know, Claudette said. We all spoke for ourselves. Knabb wouldn't let go. Now, just a minute ago, I understood you to say that you selected somebody that knew the law better. Now, who was that person? Claudette widened her eyes. Who knew the law better? A lot of people know the law better. Now, are you trying to say that Dr. King was the leader of the whole thing? Knabb rubbed his head, seemingly in exasperation. Then, drawing the syllables out one at a time, as if speaking to a small child, he said, I am merely asking if Reverend King was one of the leaders who represented your group at that time and expressed to the city commission what the Negroes wanted. Probably, Claudette replied, but I don't know. Knabb switched tacks. Now, was Attorney Gray here one of those whom you felt knew the laws? Yes, quite naturally, he's a lawyer. Did you know at the time, Nab said, voice rising, that he sustained that the state law didn't apply at all in the city of Montgomery? Claudette shook her head dismissively. I go to school myself, and I know that there's a lot of law, state law, national, and local law. Nab asked the judges to instruct Claudette to answer questions more directly. Judge Reeves told her, if you know the answers, just say yes or no, don't make speeches. So for the next few minutes, Claudette answered all of Nab's questions with one word or the other, yes or no. She broke her pattern only when Nab finally asked her the question that went right to the heart of the matter. Why did you stop riding the buses on December 5th? Because, Claudette answered, her gaze level and her voice even and intense. We were treated wrong, dirty, and nasty. Spectators in the crowd murmured yeses in response. Nab had had enough. No further questions, he said. Claudette got up and returned to her seat. Charles Langford, one of the lawyers for the plaintiffs, was deeply impressed by her presentation. If there was a star witness in the boycott case, he later told the writer Frank Sikora, it had to be Claudette Colvin. Claudette. Soon after I testified, there was a noon recess. Joanne Robinson came up and took Mary Louise Smith and me to H.L. Green's, a 5 and 10-cent store, for lunch. I had never met Mary Louise before, and I hadn't heard her bus story until that morning. We sat there eating and comparing notes about what happened to us. I liked Mary Louise, and I was proud that two teenage girls had stood up. After lunch, testimony resumed. Mayor Gale and several city commissioners insisted the segregation laws were needed to maintain order in the city. One commissioner, Clyde Sellers, warned, if segregation barriers are lifted, violence will be the order of the day. Judge Reeves thought this over for a moment in the silent courtroom. Then he asked Sellers, can you command one man to surrender his constitutional rights, if they are his constitutional rights, to prevent another man from committing a crime? Sellers had no answer to that. The hearing was adjourned in late afternoon. Claudette. When I came out of the courthouse, I was surrounded by adults. Everyone was shaking my hand. I was squeamish of people taking my hand and touching me, but I did like it when they said, oh, yes, you were great. I went back up to King Hill. Raymond was still asleep, and Mama Sweetie said, he must have known you were up to something good because he didn't give us one moment's trouble. I described the whole thing to Mom over dinner. A.C. James came over from across the street and said, you really spoke out. Mom was proud of me. I felt relieved. I called my biological mom in Birmingham and my uncle C.J. McNear. Mom telephoned Reverend Johnson and said, it's over. Claudette has testified. I called some of my schoolmates that I was still in touch with and then rocked Raymond until he went to sleep. Finally, I was alone with my thoughts. I was exhausted but proud. I had been preparing for this in my head for 3 months. The questions seemed obvious by the time I heard them. I had looked white officials in the eye and stood up for my people. I felt I had done my best. Now it was up to the judges. I looked over at Raymond, fast asleep in his bassinet, and I said, I think I might have done us some good today.